Hi everyone, welcome to our first ever Cooking with Murney Tower episode where we delve into 19th century recipes and adapt them for the modern kitchen. I'm Annabeth and I'm a historical interpreter at the Murney Tower Museum. Here's a little bit about our museum before we start. So Murney Tower is a small local museum that was opened in 1925 and is operated by the Kingston Historical Society in partnership with Parks Canada. The tower was built in 1846 and it's one of four Martello towers in Kingston. Um, we're actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a National Historical Site. We have over 1,000 military and domestic artifacts, and we offer tours, exhibits, and educational programs, kind of like this one. Um, we've also been operating for 95 years since 2020, so we're the oldest operating museum in Kingston, which is pretty cool. So, bread, why is it important to us? So, bread has been the staple food for people for, I think, thousands of years. It's always been around in some form, and it's important to the soldiers that lived in the tower because it was a part of their rations. So, the Royal Canadian Rifle Regiment lived in the tower since 1848 to 1870, and they had 1.5 pounds of brown bread as part of their ration, which we're going to try to make that brown bread today. So at 8 a.m., their breakfast would normally consist of brown bread and coffee. So I'm going to try to replicate the brown bread that they would have eaten. So you must be wondering, how on earth did they get their bread to rise? Because as you may or may not know, traditional yeast wasn't really around in the 19th century that we have today, like our jars of yeast you can buy in the store. So the idea of mixing flour, meal, and water and leaving it out on a hot day and having it ferment was always around. The wild yeast spores in the air actually come into the flour and ferment it, which is what you would probably call today is a sourdough starter. And I'm sure many of you have tried sourdough and you know it has that kind of tangy flavor, and that's from the wild yeast fermenting in the flour and water that you leave out on the counter. So in the 19th century, bread bakers either did a sourdough starter or they got their yeast from beer breweries from which they made sweet fermented breads. In the Cook Not Mad cookbook that was published in 1831, it does mention distillers' yeast as a part of their bread recipe. So this process was actually known as the Dutch process because Dutch distillers were the first who began selling yeast commercially. Now, in Europe, there are all many different types of commercial yeast that sprung up, but it wasn't until Charles Fleischmann, like you see Fleischmann's yeast today, he brought this method of making yeast to the United States and then Canada. He was trained as a young boy in a distillery where he learned that yeast was a byproduct of distilling. And that's how we still see his name on jars of yeast in the store today. So before this advent of commercial yeast, especially in Canada where you're on a frontier, barms, starters, or risings is what they would call them, were created using potatoes, hops, bran, sugar, milk, rice, pumpkin, or peas. Basically anything you had on hand to make your starter. I have included a simple starter recipe in this video in case you really want to try to make your own starter. It does give a different flavor than a traditional dry yeast would because it gives you that tangy sourdough flavor. However, starters can be extremely temperamental. I've tried them many times, and if you're not baking bread every day, it gets relentless having to constantly feed your starter. And like any living thing, it can be moody, it can be temperamental, it can require a lot of maintenance, as in feeding it and keeping it sustained. So people in the 19th century would have used starters because you just kind of consistently keep feeding it every day you make bread by adding the leftovers back in, and it's consistently maintained. So people who just moved to Canada sometimes relied on their neighbor to give them a little bit of their starter to get them started. Haha. So that's why this is a great idea for someone who's baking every day. However, for us today in our modern kitchen where we don't need to bake bread every day, I'm going to use the Fleischmann's traditional yeast. So before we get really started, make sure you have a nice clean workstation wash your hands as per any food safety guidelines. Wear an apron because the flour can get very messy. As well, I like to use 2 large bowls, one for mixing your ingredients, and then I'm going to use one to proof my bread. Try to pick one that has lots of space so your bread can puff up, and we're going to grease this later so it doesn't stick. So to start your dry yeast, your sachet or jar will have not ingredients, directions on the back to help you start your yeast. So mine says to use, well, I'm going to use how much yeast the recipe calls for. So I'm going to use half a tablespoon of dry yeast with a 1/4 cup of warm water, which I'm going to count as part of my 1.5 cups of lukewarm water, and a teaspoon of sugar, and I have to let this stand for 10 minutes. So first, if I can get this open. There we go. It's a brand new jar, so this is going to be really good yeast. So first, I'm going to use my 1/2 tablespoon of dry yeast. Let me just measure this out here. And I'm going to put that in my bowl. Here, let me angle my camera down so you can see what I'm doing. So, a bit messy, I know, but here's my dry yeast in my bowl. And then, as you can see, I have my thermometer with my water to make sure it's still warm enough to use. I am going to add a 1/4 cup of the lukewarm water, which I think I have about a 1/4 here. And I need a teaspoon of sugar. I'm just going to use white sugar for this. Yeast loves sugar to proof, so you always need sugar in there to get it started, which I'm sure people in the 19th century also used a bit of sugar to start their yeast. And now I'm just going to stir this gently. I'm just using my hand, but use a spoon, use whatever you'd like. So now that my yeast is now starting, you just let this sit now. So let this sit for 10 minutes. So hi everyone, I'm back. It's been 10 minutes and my yeast, as you can see now, is very foamy and has like a little foam on it. So that's how you know it's ready. Here, let me change my angle a little bit here. So now, as you can see, I got my recipe here. I'm gonna post it on a slide at the end of this video if you want the text for the recipe too to follow yourself. So you can just pause the video and look at it. So next, I'm gonna mix this yeast preparation with any of the remaining water. So 1 1/4 cups, because I used a 1/4 in here already. And 1/3 of my flour. So since we're only using 4 cups of flour for this, I'm gonna put 1 cup in. So I have my thermometer and my water here that I already had just to make sure it stayed at a consistent temperature for me. So I'm pouring this in, and I'm going to put 1 cup of the sifted red Fife flour. I get this from the Flourist, which is a small business in Canada. However, you can find this at any store. Usually, I think Bob's Red Mill carries red Fife, but you can use multigrain, rye, whatever you want. So I'm just measuring out 1 cup here. And I'm putting that in. And now the recipe calls for you to beat it for at least 100 strokes. I just beat it until it's well incorporated. I'm using a whisk for this. You could use a fork, your fingers, whatever you think works the best for you. So let's get this combined. So now I'm just going to put my dirty whisk in my empty measuring cup here. So now what you want to do, since you have this liquid, is you want to cover it and let it rest and rise for half an hour. Put it in somewhere warm and draft free. So I like to cover mine with saran to really seal in the steam and moisture. Some people cover it with a damp towel. I just find the saran works best for sealing it up so no drafts get in, so it stays consistent. And yeah, so that is the first step of our bread. I'm gonna go put this somewhere nice and warm, and then I'll see you in half an hour, and then we're gonna continue baking this bread. Hi, so I'm back after half an hour letting my bread proof. As you can see, this slurry that we made has now doubled in size. Remember that little bit of liquid we had? Now it's risen to about double its height. So now we're going to continue making the bread. So salt now, which I'm going to use just some sea salt and my spatula here. So first you just kind of beat it down. You always want to push down the air a bit after it's poofed up so much. And then I'm going to need another half tablespoon of salt. So let me just measure this out. So I'm going to put my salt in, and now we're just going to fold that in. So now I'm going to use some of my whole grain red spice in here. I'm going to do about 2 cups of that and 1 more cup of the sifted red spice that's not as grainy. So the goal of this is to make a workable dough that we can knead. So I am slowly incorporating this flour. So there's my 3rd cup of flour now total. I need 1 more cup after this one. And this dough is extremely dry at this point, but that's why we need it. Okay, I need 1 more cup. So now I'm going to use the sifted for my last cup. As you can see, the sifted has a bit of a lighter color. And at this point, because this part's a little difficult to mix with the spatula, I'm just going to mix it in the bowl with my hand a bit and try to fold in the rest of this flour. Okay, I'm going to put this down in my work surface here. And now it requires you to knead it for about 5 or 6 minutes lightly, so we don't want to go too crazy. So, I just do like a soft knead, and like when you knead bread or any dough for that matter, kind of want to create a sort of wave with your hands. You don't really use your upper body strength to do it. You use kind of the weight from your body and just work the dough that way. So again, I'm not pushing very hard. I'm just slightly kneading this dough. Now I'm just going to form it into a ball. I kind of just use a circular motion. So now at this point, we have a nice smooth dough, as you can see. It's not sticky, it's just workable, and it's not too stiff still. So now what we want to do is proof our bread. So here is my nice big proofing bowl. I like it because it has very high walls. And I'm just going to quickly grab some butter. I'm just going to scoop some of this out, plop it in. And since my hands are clean, all they've touched is a clean knife and this board, I'm just going to use my hands and just spread this butter into a thin layer all over this bowl so our bread does not stick. Dough ball a little bit. Okay, and then you just place them inside. And then I'm just going to cover it again with some saran wrap. I saved the pieces I used for the first proofing, like so. Again, you can use a damp towel if you prefer. However, I find this seals in the dough from any drafts. So, I'm going to angle it up. So, when I proof my bread, unfortunately, in my apartment right now, usually in the summer, I don't have air conditioning. It gets extremely humid and hot. So I could normally just leave it on the counter and it would just proof beautifully. However, because it's been a little chilly the last couple of days here, my apartment isn't necessarily the humid, hot condition I would like. So in this case, what I do is I kind of cheat a little. I I put my oven in the warming setting, usually about 170 degrees Fahrenheit, before I proof my bread. Let it get warm, but not hot. You don't want it to be 170 the whole time. You just want it to be warm inside. So my oven's warm right now. I place my dough in and I find that consistent temperature being sealed inside the oven away from drafts helps it really proof well. But I will stress, do not have your oven be hot because then it'll dry your dough out. I turn it on 170 when I start the process, and then I just let it cool right down. And then the oven's just like a warm place. So I'm gonna go proof my bread recipes. I proofed it for about an hour and a half to 2 hours. Basically the goal is you want it to double in bulk again. So you know how you saw the yeast, how it doubled, you saw how big it got. We want it to get that big for our dough. And I'm gonna do this process twice because the more you proof this way, the more air and lightness you'll have in your bread. So I'm gonna do this first proofing for about an hour and a half. Hi everyone, it's been an hour and a half, and because I used my oven this time as my proofing environment instead of doing it the more natural way, of course, because the heat is so concentrated. This is what my dough now looks like. As you can see, it's definitely doubled in size. So now before my second bulking or proofing, I'm gonna punch it down and get all the air out of it. Okay, so after punching it down, what I like to do is kind of removing it from the bowl and shaping it into what the French call a boule. Now, in the 19th century, most likely they just formed it into a shape and then, left it to its own devices. However, I would like a nice round loaf. So I am folding in all the sides into the bottom like that. And then I am kind of tucking it in a circle so it creates this nice bowl shape for the dough. So now you're going to place it back inside your bowl. Make sure it's still well greased enough so your dough won't stick. And rewrap it and put it back where you had it for another hour and a half, or until it's doubled in size again. So for this stage, I like using my bread basket. You could easily purchase them on Amazon or any kitchen store, really. They look like this with a linen cloth inside. I've already pre-floured mine. They normally come with instructions. And what you want to do after you form it into the boule shape is you're going to place it the smooth side up inside your bread basket. And then, as you can see, I get very messy. Then what you would like to do is just flour the bottom really well. I just use all-purpose for this because really it's not for the main body of your bread. It's just to make sure she doesn't stick. And then I'm going to reuse my saran wrap again to wrap him tight. Because it doesn't stick well, I use a cloth. Doesn't have to be damp, just something to really put some weight on that saran. And then this is going to go back in the warm spot you were proofing your bread before. So I'll see you again in another hour and a half, and we'll finally do the baking stage of our bread. See you soon. I'll check in again. Hi, so it's been about an hour and a half-ish, and as you can see, it's already gone over the top of my bread basket. So I think we're ready for our final proofing. Yes, there's one more proof time to go. So now this is when you have to decide. This recipe can be divided into two to make two smaller loaves. You can use a loaf pan if you want, like the rectangular one. You can just form it into a boule and bake it on a parchment tray. My oven doesn't retain heat very well, so I'm going to use a Dutch oven, or in the 19th century they called them bake kettles. They would actually put them on an open flame. So I'm not totally veering away from the 19th century style by any means. So I'm using is my good old stove Dutch oven. And when you preheat your oven, which you will have to after the half hour, to 400 degrees Fahrenheit, I put my stove in the oven as it preheats because it's enameled with glass and you don't want your Dutch oven to crack. So what I do when I'm letting my bread do the final proof is I cut a piece of parchment paper that I'm going to use to form my bread on and lift it into my hot Dutch oven. So let me angle her down here. So as you see, we have our happy double proofed bread. So again, once more, you got to punch her down a little bit. I'm going to flip him over. I'm again going to fold this bread into the form I want it to bake at. So again, we're going to create a bowl, which as we know, you kind of tuck in all the edges into the center, like so, kind of stretching them over each other until you make, let's get those chunkies out of there, put them in, kind of making a nice little ball, right? And you kind of tuck it in a circle. Now at this point of the baking stage, what you want to do is if you want to add any decoration, now would be the time. So for me, I like attempting anyway, because I'm no baker by any means professionally. I like getting an extremely sharp knife and trying to do the nice cuts. So I'm going to get my knife. I have my freshly sharpened knife here. Now, professional bread bakers will use a razor. I'm no professional, so we're going to do it this way. And you want to just make a cut in your dough. I'm going to do the nice little cross here. Okay, like that, as you see. And then I am going to put him on my parchment. However, you might want to flour your parchment with some all-purpose flour, whatever flour you have, very well. So then you can put it on and you won't stick. And now this little dough ball is again going to proof for about half an hour. So I would put him in a warm place that's not drafty again. What I might do is I might just put my parchment like so to lift him back into my bread basket. Get my saran wrap I've been using. I'm just going to put my towel over it and it's going to go again in my, not in my warm draftless place. It'll only be a half hour, so I'm going to check in again to show you the final stage of baking the bread. Okay, so we're finally done proofing. This is how she looks after sitting in the bread basket in the oven for a half hour, actually less than that. I took it out maybe 25 minutes. So now it's ready to go in the oven. So if you are using a loaf pan, this previous step I did where I formed it and proofed it, you should form it into the loaf pan and proof it inside the loaf pan because this will be impossible to get in. Since I wanted it to be a boule, that's how it's going to be. As well, if you're using the boule technique, make sure to put a piece of parchment that you're going to bake it with so it's easy to lift in and out of your Dutch oven or onto your baking sheet. I'm personally using a Dutch oven because, again, it helps retain heat and moisture for your bread, which makes it nice and crispy. You really want that outer crust. So I have a spray bottle here, but you can use just your fingertips to spray it. Before it bakes, I like spraying it with a bit of water to get that extra crisp on the outside. So I'm just going to do a bit of a spritz. I'm also going to reflour it just a tiny bit so there's no stickiness. Okay, and my oven's preheating. So once it's preheated, I will put it in my Dutch oven by lifting it using my parchment like so, and we'll bake it. Baking it takes about 25 to 30 minutes. You want to make sure it's done on the inside. You could use a skewer or a thermometer just to poke it to make sure the inside doesn't stick to your probe, I guess you could say. If it doesn't stick, it means it's done. Or if you poke it, it should be it should not be like gooey when you touch it. It should be hard and crisp. I think mine took, when I tested this recipe, it took about 30 minutes. And because this loaf is quite large, I think it'll be about 30 minutes if you didn't separate them. So I'm gonna pop it in the oven and I'll show you the final result. Okay, so I just took my bread out, so it's quite hot, so I can't really lift it very well without my mitts. So mine needed about, I took it out at the 30-minute point, and I noticed there wasn't a lot of browning on the top, so I wanted it to brown a little more on the crust. So I did it for another 8 minutes, and it looks pretty good. So here, I'll just angle it. Actually, no. Let me lift it for you. So it's still in my Dutch oven, and as you can see, it's a very happy loaf of bread. I will do probably one more update image once I can take it out. Okay, so I've been able to remove my loaf from the oven. Now, as you can see, it's still very hot, so I don't want to cut it yet. However, as you can tell, it spread a little bit, probably because my Dutch oven's so wide. You know, I'm no professional baker, so that's okay with me. I mean, it's still very puffy and like it has some great bubbles in it, as you can probably tell. As well, you probably notice that that crust is super crisp, which will be perfect. I prefer when my crust is really nice. So yeah, I can't wait to dig in. I hope you all enjoyed our first episode of Cooking with Murney Tower. I've included the written directions for the recipe at the end of this video, and thank you very much for joining me. I can't wait to see you in our next episode. Bye!